Let me change my name.
All right, we're just loading. Okay, we're live.
Okay, perfect. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another program where we focus on the Blue Umbrella Day campaign, which has been implemented into Guyana's 1000 Boys Initiative. So for those who might be fairly new to joining us here, it really focuses on highlighting the sexual violence experienced by young boys, which is a very unexplored population when it comes to sexual assault. So today we'll be focusing on some of the myths surrounding sexual abuse, what those might look like, what contributors there are to it, and some of the things that we can do to move away from these myths and create healthier and safer environments for boys and other populations that are vulnerable. So today we have with us on our panel Mr. Vidyarata Kasoon and Mr. Judah Prescott. And for those who might not be familiar with you or who might just need another introduction to who you are, would you mind just giving a brief statement on yourself and the work that you do? If we can start with you, Judah. You're on mute, Judah.
My apologies. You can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. And so I want to start off by saying good afternoon to everyone who's tuned in and everyone who's listening. I do bring greetings on behalf of the Minister of Human Services and Social Security, that is the Honorable Dr. Vindhya Vasani Prasad, and the Director of the Child Care and Protection Agency. I am Mr. Judah Prescott, and today I'll be the representative from the Child Care and Protection Agency, here to pitch in, here to bring awareness, as Ms. Akola would have said. And so that's basically my sentence.
Thanks so much, Judah. Vidya?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Akola, and thanks, Chilling, for involving me here. So my name is Vidyarata Kasoon, and I'd first of all like to bring into the space the survivors of sexual assault, all who were one of, I'm thinking of a particular woman, a young woman this week, who has experienced sexual assault by a very powerful man in Guyana, and that there's not going to be any accountability. So we bring that into the space, and just acknowledging trigger warnings, setting that up for in the discussion, that people can know that they could reach out for help, for counseling, through ChildLink or other places. So I'm Vidyarata Kasoon, and I have been doing work around gender-based violence and protection of children related to gender-based violence, and more about the gender-based violence work. I'm particularly concerned about issues like beating of children, and also the silence around child sexual abuse and the lack of opportunities for healing and recovery beyond court. We usually think court is the final thing, so that's something that we're quite interested in now, making sure that there's ongoing. The court is not the final step in the recovery, especially when many, as like this young woman is finding out, there's not going to be any justice. Because the abuser has very powerful connections. So so that's just roughly it. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Vidya. And thanks so much to you both for taking the time out to be with us today and share your perspectives. I do know that you both have quite a wealth of experience and knowledge in these areas. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion. And just to build on some of the work that you have been involved in, with the focus being particularly on myths surrounding sexual assault, what would you say are some of the myths surrounding SA that you have come across in your work? Vidya, how about we start with you?
Right. So I think there are quite a few, and what happens is that some are common, some are common across all kinds of populations. But for the first thing is that it is minimized. That people think that sexual assault doesn't, that people could recover from it, especially boys could pick up and get on and recover from it more easily than girls. And that is myth number one. So therefore, and many boys are made to feel that something is wrong with them if they're not recovering, or that they didn't, that they don't get on with it. The second thing is that people believe that those who've experienced sexual assault, that they did something, especially, when you hear that boys and girls, that they did something to deserve it, or they came on. So for boys might be told that, that they're gay or effeminate or something like that, or weak, or something is wrong with them. That is why the predators came to them. So that is another myth which has to be unpacked. And I think another myth which happens is that you can't heal or recover from having experienced sexual assault, that the damage is permanent. And I think that has created problems because there are never any opportunities for healing as well and recovery, because the stories aren't told because of the stigma, etc. So so there are others as well, but I just thought maybe Judah, from the work they're doing CPA, what else they're coming for us. Yeah.
All right, thank you much, Mr. Kisun, and you made quite a few valid points. What I would say in my professional experience, I have found that a lot of people believe that child sexual abuse happens mostly to girls. And this is a huge myth. And this is a huge belief that a lot of people have. And what we need to be aware of and what we need to understand is that boys are sexually abused too. It's not just girls. And a lot of times that sexual abuse may not be reported. I mean, of course, at the agency, we do have cases where boys are abused. And while we may have higher cases when it comes to girls being abused, that does not mean that more boys are not being abused. All that means is that we have more reported cases of girls being abused. And the reason for that, it comes all the way back to society and socialization and what we're taught growing up. Girls are taught to be vulnerable, to feel guilty, to have shame when it comes to certain things, to be clean, to be attractive, and so forth. Whereas our males are taught that they're powerful. They are taught to never be seen as a victim. They are taught that molestation may lead to, like Mr. Kisun would have said, homosexuality. They're taught that it's cool to be initiated by a female, irrespective of the age of that female. And so because of socialization and because of some of these beliefs, we find that there's much more stigma attached to males when they come forward to say that, look, I have been abused. And so one of the biggest myths I have found in my professional capacity is that boys are not being sexually abused. All right. Another myth that I wanted to highlight briefly before I hand the baton back to Ms. Akola is that child sexual abuse doesn't happen in good communities. Now, sexual abuse does not have a face. A lot of times we look at certain communities and we look at certain races of individuals and we say, well, look, this is happening here. But the truth is that child sexual abuse can happen in any community. It can happen in a community that we would say is a hot spot for crime. And I'm just going to go ahead here and rip the Band-Aid off. We have Tiger Bay. Some people may assume that Tiger Bay is a hot spot for sexual abuse, that a lot of children or female children are being abused, or even males in Tiger Bay. Whereas we may have a community, let's look at Windsor Estates. People may say, oh, no, that type of thing isn't happening in Windsor Estates. But you know what the reality is? We have had cases in every community. So even the ones that you think are the best, we have had cases from those communities. And so that's another myth. Sexual abuse does not have a face, and it can occur in any community. All right, so let's have an open mind and let's be more aware. Let's keep our ears and eyes open. Let's not just focus on one demographic, but let us look at sexual abuse as a disease, as an illness that can happen to anybody, to any child. So those are just two myths I wanted to highlight. I'll now hand back to you, Ms. Thompson.
So, okay, I want to elaborate on something too. So just a couple of other things. So the other myth is that child sexual abuse happens by strangers. More often than not, it is happening by someone who is close to the child. And again, we're using word child as 1 to 18, but very often sexual assault happens by someone who is known to the family or in a position of authority. Then there's great protection because there's shaming. And Soumya Sharanand today wrote a letter. I was quite surprised to see the letter, where he was talking about how parents accept settlement because they want to protect shame and all of that. But what happens is that the perpetrator then goes on to somebody else, right? He settles one case and then moves on to someone else. So that myth, and the other thing is that people think that sometimes this thing comes as an attack, like it is a violent kind of attack. But very often there's grooming. The person who's committing sexual abuse could be friendly. There could be transactional issues going on, and we know that poverty is about, while it's quite right that child sexual abuse happens across all communities, there's an issue that for a lack of, say, poverty or a lack of, the predators will know to prey on certain vulnerabilities. And therefore, boys and girls who are poor could be more vulnerable if, for example, they're depending on transactions, and they might think because they're getting food in return for the sexual favor that's okay, because it's not like I'm doing this for nothing. I'm getting food, I'm getting clothes, whatever, the money, whatever. And that is a reality that happens. And then, of course, if they have to protect the family, they feel that they have to protect the family, so they mustn't speak out. So that myth about it's a stranger, and that is often why it is so difficult to report, because you're reporting people who are close. You're really breaking up family, and that is why the reporting doesn't happen. And the other thing that really we have to think through as well is that for boys, especially, and perhaps girls, teenage boys, depending on the body, is that if they experience arousal, or as you just said, you're told that, oh, if this big woman initiating you into sex, if you're a boy or whatever, that you're supposed to like it. And if you experience an arousal, you have an erection, you have a climax, that somehow you enjoyed it, and that therefore nothing bad happened. But the body, we should clarify that the body has its own reaction to things, and that the sign of arousal, and our Sexual Offences Act now makes that clear. Before it wasn't an issue, but now it's very clear that, especially for a male victim, an arousal or sign of ejaculation or cannot be used, as a defense, especially if the person drugged the child, or gave them alcohol or drugs and then took advantage of them. Because that is another element where people said, oh, if I didn't go drinking with this big man, then maybe this wouldn't have happened to me, and I'm responsible for it. So that too, right? There's this element of drugs and so on. This is all part of the grooming and the initiation, right? Sitting down to watch pornography, the older person trying to show the child pornography and all of that. So there's this kind of grooming that goes on. So when it does happen, people are confused because it wasn't like they're, and it's very confusing, especially if the person is giving gifts and is nice, in other ways. And this, of course, is an experience, especially with, with children, because that's how the predators learn. Yeah.
Right. And just checking to see if I was muted again. So you made some very valid points, and I just wanted to cement, what you would have said about the myth. Most times people view it as a stranger being the alleged perpetrator, when 1 in 5 cases, and research will support this, it's a family member. And a lot of times we want to say that it's a male family member. We have had cases where there have been females who would have abused children too. That's another myth, that only there can only be male perpetrators, and that isn't so. It can be anybody in the family circle, and it transcends age as well. It can be anybody from any age group. We have had cases, grandparents, uncles, and even other teenagers as well. So I just wanted to cement that bit, because that is a really largely believed myth. So Ms. Thompson, let me hand the baton back to you.
Sure. And they're just thinking through the family members, right? Is that now we're also acknowledging the family members who know and are not doing anything about it are as guilty. And we have to name that now. Whether, and this is something recently an adult survivor disclosed about it in their family. And unfortunately, ChildLink and the CPA, so try to do a community intervention because there's intergeneration. It is as though it's a family culture. Because as the woman especially started to speak out, and then realizing that there's, this is something that's happening, but that no one has talked about it openly because there are threats, etc. And the families, one is, it's big families and big communities and all of that. So, and there are prominent people in the community, all that madness. But this is another survivor who's broken rank and gone away, but still can't talk, has disclosed about being an adult survivor, but has not been able to say who. And this is where, because the saying who will mean a severing from the family. And that is another deeper issue, right? So even though they disclose it, okay, I survived, but I can't say who did it, right? And the fact that that person is doing it to others, and that's, that's when I got, this information came to me as a by the way. And it's when I said, no, I have to invoke the CPA, because if the abuse is still in Guyana, living in a community, then other children are, and this person said, yes, other children could be vulnerable, but there was no way of reaching except indirectly through community work and school work, and that kind of thing. But this is how complex it is when people protect abusers. They protect the abusers and protect the family rather than protect those who are, who are experiencing this violence. Yeah. finish.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. You both raised some really important points that we could probably talk about for quite a lot of time. One of the things I really want to two things I want to hone in on. First, Vidya, you talked about the family dynamics when it comes to sexual assault and the ways that a lot of persons within the family might be very aware, but also the issues of transactional transactional sort of abuse, wherein children are often utilized to secure income for the home. Persons tend to look at cases like this in a very lax manner, in a sense, because they believe that poverty kind of excuses the abuse. What do you necessarily say to this?
Right. So I say no. I mean, nobody should be engaged in transact. And you know, we had this discussion. I remember years ago there was an issue with a 14-year-old trans woman who pretended to be 16 or 17 doing sex work and having ended up in jail because she attacked one of her clients. And then the whole thing emerged that she was underage and should not have been in Camp Street, right? But in the complexity of the story, you know, people were saying, oh, but you know, age of consent, and it was okay if you know if the 16-year-old was doing sex work. And I was like, no way, 18 is the age of work. If we're talking work, right? If you want to say, and this is not, and secondly, the issues around choice and consent, that's not what this individual is experiencing, because there was drugs, there was all sorts of things involved, right?
Mhm.
And abuse and all of that happening. So definitely people will you know kind of say, oh, you know, and people do. There, you know, around the world, there are awful stories of people who do sell their children into sex work, into this kind of thing. That is and in Ghana, with older children, you start to hear a dynamic, you know, that like with a 15-year-old girl, 14-year-old girl, and maybe the boys, but no one will know because no one's looking at the boys to see what's happening with the boys.
Yeah.
Right? And we only hear these things when adults will now sort of say, because of course, you know, you have to allow the stories without a shaming of the stories, you know, to explain that where they'll start to say, oh, since I was 15, XYZ, you know, did this or whatever. And 15, 14, before we had the age of consent for boys, you know, there was this happening, boots and all of that, and jeans and clothes, and of course nobody was really, because people assumed the boys could look after themselves and could make these negotiations on their own, right? And there have been some pretty horrific murders, which when you investigate, you realize that there's a dynamic that happened that might have happened when the murderer was much younger. And I'm sure Judah will know more about some of those. But the vibe, just as you read the narrative, you want to know, why is a 16 or 17-year-old, 18-year-old going to attack a man who they visited? They used to visit, you know, that kind of madness. But then obviously things went too crazy. And yes, I mean, you know, the violence is so we can't, no, there should be no tolerance. This is not work. This is not the idea that a 14-year-old boy who's doing sex work against his, no, that's not what we want. I mean, there are things about chores and teenagers who could work outside the home for certain kinds of activities to earn an income, which doesn't affect their school work. You know, that's a whole kind of different discussion. We don't expect sex work or transactional sex, especially, you know, that's not what we expect, because sexuality has its own complications and discussions, and consent is a major part of it. Having information and being able to make consent and having the rights is really important. So we should not be this saying, oh, this is another kind of work. You know, that yes. And you know, if it's a big woman who want to do the wedding and give me money for it, you might as well, because next year you can turn 16. Yeah. And that was another thing. Couple more months, they can be 18. I remember one of the first cases reporting to Child Care and Protection Agency when it started in 2009, 2010 was with a boy who just turned 18. Thankfully, the CP at the time took the case, because what's a birthday? What's a date, if you know what I mean, right? And they had to help and intervene because this boy was in a very complicated situation. So yeah, so we can't use that's not under no circumstances do we assume that working for sex and transactional sex with children, boys and girls are involved should be excused as any other way of children helping their families to earn an income. That's not what we're about, right?
Thanks so much, Vidya.
And Ms. Thompson, if I can just jump
Certainly.
in here. While we have no tolerance, and there should never at any point in time be any tolerance for that, any tolerance or no excuse, I feel like we do have to take into consideration some of the factors that lead to this sort of thing. And powerlessness makes children extremely vulnerable. And I think there was a case that was done by Graph. I think 6 years, so 6 years.
Judah, we're getting you a bit broken at the moment. Or is it just me, Vidya? Can you hear him clearly?
No, I just sent you the. I'll repeat what you said just now. Maybe we can turn off the video for a little bit. Your internet, like it went a little bit. Yeah. Yeah, I think you were giving the example.
You hear me now?
Yeah, we hear you now. Yeah. The internet went for a little bit.
So
yeah.
I was talking about a case study that was taken abroad. Basically, in this case study, 6 inmates agreed to speak with small groups of students about what it is they look for when they are looking for their victims. And what I found particularly interesting is that they look for children who hang back. They look for children who need attention. They look for children who are poor, who appear to be poor. They look for children who have low self-esteem and all of these things. And so this case study, I think, is very important since it helps us to see some of the things that they look for. And that helps us to become more cognizant of some of the factors that we need to take into consideration, because people just don't do these things just like that. And while there's no tolerance, there is the need for education, which is why, we have been collaborating with ChildLink to sensitize communities. We have been doing community outreaches. Even in the pandemic, we've been reaching out. We've been doing so many campaigns, and we have done, we would have launched last year our Every Child Safe campaign, where in communities we're developing, and this is something that we would have started prior to the campaign, but we started to establish a bit more community watch groups in communities. And so they can be our eyes and ears, because when it comes to reporting child abuse, many times, and there really is no excuse for reporting child abuse as far as our agency is concerned. We have our 914 hotline, it's 24-hour. We have our normal phone hotline. We have several departmental hotlines, and so people can make reports. Added to that, we have our social media. And so at the end of the day, what we're saying at this point is that though we have these factors as an agency, we're encouraging people to be our eyes and ears and to reach out to us and to let us know when something is going on. That's the only way that we will be able to help. All right, so Ms. Thompson, I just wanted to say that bit. I want to hand back to you at this point.
Thanks so much, Judah. There was a point you made earlier concerning the views and the different rates of sexual assault between boys and girls. From your perspective, working at the CPA and other relevant knowledge you might have, has there been any significant rise in rates of reports from boys? And what do you think are some of the major contributors to either lack of reporting from young boys or increase in reporting if there has been any?
All right. So one thing I'm going to say is that, you know, we're still in a pandemic. And even though we have some of the measures being pulled back a bit, the pandemic has impacted reports, and I'll tell you why. Normally, we would have had children going to school and so forth. We would have had teachers noticing certain signs. You know, prior to the pandemic, we had people socializing a whole lot more. Now there's the whole 6 feet thing and so forth. And so that's something that we need to take into consideration before I say anything about the stats. I will say at this point in time that we have had more reports concerning girls. And like I said initially, and this is my disclaimer, that doesn't necessarily mean, and I can't definitively say that it means that boys are not being abused. It can mean because of socialization and because of how males are brought up, it's harder having them come forward to make reports, but that doesn't mean that they are not being abused.
I think, Akola, I think there was another dynamic too, right? That because of the law in Guyana, so for example, every underage pregnancy is automatically reported. You know what I mean? So straight away, there's probably more, there could probably be more physical signs when a child has experienced abuse, more than say when boys have experienced abuse. So say family members and so who might, if they, especially on the age, you know, depending on the age, right? So family members might more notice what's happening. So I think that too is a dynamic. And also, and I'm just sharing again, my experience is not because I've spoken to boy children who survived the adults. So you know what I mean, the adult survivors, male adult survivors of child abuse. So these are people who are older, who now reflect on what has happened. And typically, ironically, because boy children, depending on the family structures, Judith said just now, sometimes there is some pressure on boy children to protect the family too. So the boys who are in a dysfunctional family, if they're made to feel that they cannot break up this family and they have to keep this secret, they will have that pressure, and therefore there'll be no disclosing that somebody's trying to touch them. You know, but there's no pregnancy, or unless of course, depending on what the form of the abuse is, unless there's an STI or something like that. And I think that's how some cases have come forward recently. But now the medical profession is more in tune. There's a law which requires that the doctors and nurses must report if they suspect. They don't have to prove anything. They just have to suspect. And once the doctors and nurses suspect, then they could, you know, make a report, and then the CPA does the investigation. But if those things are not, say, happening, but there might be some mental behavioral issues, but nobody will investigate those, because here we just beat children who behaving bad, right? Without trying to find out what's going on with people, right? Or we holler at them and scream at them and so on. So therefore, I suspect that is why it's going to take a while to get those reports to healing. And then there might be, God knows what the police would say. If the police would laugh if boy children or teenage boys come forward. You know, we don't know, you know, there's no protocol. The police have not published any protocols as yet. about how they're dealing with these matters. So that no one knows what to expect. I mean, if you go through the CACs, the child advocacy centers, and that's, but what about the places where there are no child advocacy centers, right? So we also have to do a lot of work too, because the other dynamic is that many of the boys probably themselves, even though they might feel funny and bad, and they might not recognize that there's something bad and criminal happening to them,
Mhm. Yeah.
right? Because for the dynamic, for that it is only girls have this, and that's why, that's another thing, is that they might not recognize that the older boys, say for example, they might not recognize this is something bad and that should be reported. And then there's a lovely meme that Chilling, that you guys sent yesterday, is that the boys then don't have anybody to tell, because you're supposed to keep you're supposed to keep your problems to yourself,
Mhm.
right? You're not supposed to tell anybody. You're supposed to deal with your problems yourself. And if that means picking up a knife to do it, but how do you pick up a knife to somebody who treating you nice otherwise, giving you money and so otherwise, So
Mhm.
so this is the complexity of what's happening.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks so much for going into that video. It's some very, I think, like when it comes to abuse, people think it's something that can be viewed in isolation, but there's so many different things that comes together that makes it a very complex a very complex occurrence. And on the topic of abuse and the way that, personal behaviors are usually used to rationalize it, whether that's physical, sexual, there's often the myth that passion and loss of control is the reason why many persons tend to abuse or commit abusive behaviors. How does this belief contribute towards excusing and further promoting further abuse? Judah, would you like to go ahead first on this one?
Certainly. So passion and loss of control. And I smiled before I smiled when I heard this, because usually in your interaction with parents who have parents or caregivers who have physically abused their children, that's something that you'll hear quite often. I lost control. I didn't mean to. It just happened. You know, these are things that are heard quite often. And it comes right back to the fact that there is no excuse for what was done, but we also have to take into consideration, and at the Child Care and Protection Agency, what we offer free parenting skills training. And so when we realize that there is a gap in between what the parental practices should be and what they are, we offer parenting skills training to bring the parental practices of that parent on par. Um, and so it is possible that an uneducated parent can lose control because of their own socialization, also because of culture. And in Guyana, we have had this culture for the longest while, uh, that children have to receive lashes as a form of correction. And this is something that we really do need to get rid of, because studies have shown that lashes, that physical violence does absolutely nothing for that child. And so at the end of the day, what we want people to understand is that even though parents can lose control, even though caregivers can lose control or something can happen in the moment, what we want to do as an agency is to ensure that every parent has the tools.
Judah, you're breaking up a bit again. I think we lost you. Okay. Judah, can you hear me? I was just saying that you broke up a bit and we lost you when you were speaking about some of the tools that parents can utilize when it comes to dealing with challenges, I believe. But while we probably wait on Judah to come back, Vidya, would you like to take a go at this question?
Oh yeah, I mean, our culture of violence and our culture says that provocation, that other people make them do it. And I mean, I am trying to deal with two parents who are constantly screaming and shouting at their kids. And you know, it's one of these, you're right, Nicole, it's very complicated because I can see that these two parents are trying their best with their, you know, the children are alternately laughing and hollering. Yeah, and it's awful to listen, and other people are hearing. And I sometimes feel like I should tape them to go and play it back to them because I don't think they understand themselves what is happening. You know, I don't think they hear themselves. And yeah, because we have a culture of violence to say it's okay, especially men. No limits, no controls, no accountability for consequences. Apparently, we can do what we want, but there's no accountability, especially if it's those who are around us or weaker. So we continue to excuse violence, and in doing that, we're losing the opportunity to transform our behavior and to learn better ways of behaving. That to learn how we can manage ourselves, to learn how to take care of ourselves so that we're not lashing out at anybody or even harming ourselves, because people do all kinds of things in passion. We're driving on the road like mad people. We're, you know, and we see this. We are in an increasingly violent culture, and we're not getting any examples of how to break out of that. The stories of how to break out of that and change are not being told. And you know, there's violence and the threats of. I remember that's our you know, this violence is part of the whole colonial history, right? So when the whole madness with beating children in school, up to now we haven't cleared that up. The hairstyle issue in school, the Ministry of Education is still consulting on it. For what reason? You know what I mean? Why is the story? Colonialism is done, slavery done. You know, what are you doing still? You know, you want us, if we're going to unpack. But you know, the violence isn't. It's not just this loss of control. There's another element to it, is that there's another. People think that the abusive behavior is like violent and but we also have abusive behavior which is slow, strategic, manipulative. It's not just the violent, and sometimes, you know, the violent one is sort of easier to see. But there are other people who go to great lengths to abuse, to stalk, to manipulate, to demean their kids and others, which have nothing to do with losing control. It's about wanting control over the other.
Yeah.
Right? And that comes to bad sense of self. And I just like to invoke Dr. Janice Jackson, who comes back. You know, that we all have to do a reflection on this damaged sense of self that we've created in this post-colonial, you know, heritage that says that we have to be violent or else. You know, if we're not going to be violent, we're going to be violated. So when you hear, I mean, when I hear the poor mother shouting these children, y'all not hearing me, and I want to say, you know, sis, I hear you next door. Why do you think them children are bothering with you? You know, and I've tried to explain to them that the children learn now how to push the buttons. So who has the control? When you lose control because something a child does, don't you think the children are understanding that is the way to control you? Because they can press the buttons to make you flare off, right? And these are the kinds of conversations we dare not have. And I always remember a child at the senior secondary school telling me whenever her mother and father beat her, this is a child, senior side, she says, I just get satisfaction. And then I realized what she was trying to say is that because she knows to push them to the limit, and if that reaction is a violent reaction, she feels that she's done something to get them to react out of the norm. And that is the madness that we're doing to each other in our stupid Guyana. You know what I mean? This is the madness that we're doing. We're training people how to press, you know, how to trigger us and all kind of craziness. instead of us now having the conversations, how do we heal? How do we learn? How do we learn better not to be? How do we learn about ourselves? How do we breathe? How do we breathe together? You know, but
Yeah.
we're not. There are no there are no opportunities to do it. There are no example. There's no incentive to do it, right?
Mhm.
So it's very complicated. Yeah.
Yes, certainly. And it's really great that you
Um,
raised the point that abuse is not always, something that's easily seen, because a lot of times it is manipulative. And, a factor of that is seen through like grooming, which is not always very, physically visible at the moment. It's kind of a long process. So there's that. Jude, I see you're back with us. Would you like to finish the thoughts you were making before the internet did its thing?
Certainly, and I do apologize for that. Basically, what I was coming to was modeling. A lot of parents, a lot of caregivers have been victims of abuse themselves. And so without even realizing that they're modeling, because when you have experienced a certain type of trauma, if you have not dealt with that trauma, then you become very unaware of how you are causing history to repeat itself. And so there are a lot of parents who are broken. As we know, hurt people hurt people. So at the end of the day, and I think Mr. Kisun touched on self-awareness. It's very important to be aware of your traumas, aware of what you have went through, so that you can work on it to be the best parent, to be the best caregiver for your child, for your children, or for those that you parent. And so modeling is also another reason that may cause a parent or caregiver to actually lose control or do something in passion. And so it calls for a lot of self-introspection. And even as I'm speaking, if you're hearing me, you can go into your mind and you can reflect. A lot of times when people have been through trauma, it was so traumatic that they put it all the way into their subconscious without realizing that it actually affects them. It affects every aspect of their lives. And this is why I say to young people, um, having a child, starting a family is no joke. There's so many things that you need to really think about if you are going to give back to Guyana. In Guyana, we want functional families. We want functional people, functional children. So you really need to think about how you're starting a family, who you're starting a family with, have conversations in your relationships. Fair enough, some things happen, and you may just get into a situation, there's one night stands, there's other unfortunate things that may happen that may lead to individuals starting families. But what I'm saying is do self-introspection, be more aware of your traumas, and work on it. Come into us, and even if it's not a service that we provide directly, we will be sure to point you in the right direction. So that's a message that I really wanted to get out there. So back to you, Ms. Thompson.
Thanks so much, Yuda. And it is very important for us all to become more aware of our traumas and ensure that we're not, projecting that onto others, particularly children, because that's a cycle that just continues. So when it comes to, Juda, you just shared that persons who might wish to gain some knowledge or resources can definitely reach out to CPA. But aside from things like that, what do you think are some of the things that individuals and communities can do to kind of move away from some of the myths surrounding sexual assault and really create environments that are conducive for safety and healing and support for those vulnerable to sexual assault?
The first thing off the bat, stop being ignorant to knowledge. This is something that's ingrained in our society. There are a lot of information out there, there's education available, but there are a lot of people who just don't want to know. They could care less. right? So be more open-minded because the education is there. And I like to talk about what's happening currently. There's several programs, there's several outreaches that we are doing currently. And so we have realized as an agency that there are many communities that are plagued with different social ills. We have our statistics, and so every department, what we would do, whether if it's quarterly, yearly, we look to see what communities are really suffering from, what are some of the social ills they're being faced with, and we develop programs to target those social ills. Because as you know, and if you've ever done program evaluation, you would know that you just can't go into communities and start a program. You have to do an evaluation first. You need to do a needs assessment to find out what's going on in this community and what are some of the issues it has. And so we do that, we come back to the drawing table and we develop our programs. Now, after our programs have run, there's an evaluation process that we do to see how best we would have met the needs of those individuals. So for this year, we have several parenting skills training programs that will be launched in various communities. And this is something that individuals can look out for. We have already started to prep for that. And so parents can look forward to benefiting from that. But what I want to say is, you know, don't be ignorant of the information. It's there. Our doors are open. We have an open door policy. So come into us, reach out to us. We have several numbers, which I will share with you. You know, reach out, come into us. The information is available and we're bringing the service to you because as a ministry, we promise, we deliver. So that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Judah. Vidya, any thoughts on
Right.
that?
So from the experience I've had is that there's something that happened within the last 20 years in Guyana. This is something that hit me a couple of weeks ago when a 21-year-old boy killed a 19-year-old girl. Because that 21-year-old boy grew up in a time in Guyana when we'd already passed the Domestic Violence Act. We're aware of all these issues. We had all these programs and awareness. The difficulty is because our education system is such a mess where people do things you learn things to pass exams and then forget about it, but it doesn't necessarily have any personal connection to you. So there are people, for example, who can tell you in an exam what abuse is and what domestic violence is, but when it is happening to them, they don't recognize. Or when they're doing it, they don't recognize it as abusive behavior. Right? We are concerned with a particular agency where the head of that agency, the agency is responsible for some of these issues, but the head of that agency operates in a very abusive manner to the sub-workers. Right? So this is the disconnect. We have, I think the word is called cognitive dissonance, right? Where what has not happened deeper is this personal accountability for the change to realize, hold on a minute. The fact that I buy food for these children, them children got everything that they wanted. I never had as a child, but I'm still in here, I put 2 lash on them for hear me still, you know, they got everything, whatever. Is that, and yes, I don't want to go around the place with something marked trauma on my forehead. Because, you know, there's this thing about like all of we damage, but the fact that we have to realize we're not, that when we say that we're not perfect individuals, people like to say that we're not talking in terms of the context of sin and all of that. That's not, sometimes you have to think about what is it that you're doing that is causing harm to yourself and others and the children and how, and it is possible to heal from that. And it's not a one-off thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's a process, and unfortunately, I mean, yes. So you have the workshops and so to access the manuals, but I think there are also resources, videos, and everything. I know You know, when people keep saying, oh, it's a white people thing, I said, here, no, we already got a lot of white people thing going on in this place. You can just add another one, which is good for you. You know what I mean? Right? It's always a white people thing we talk about. But yeah, these are conversations all over the world. You know, everyone has had, there's a violence or history. We have histories of violence, all of us. So whether it's foreign or local, that's what connects us. Don't tell me, yes, Guyanese culture to beat children, but why? What does that mean? You know what I mean? What does that mean? Does it mean that culture changes? We had a culture of slavery and it changed, right? So well, we don't change anything, you know, and so this personal commitment to healing and transformation, but also what is not happening is that there is this dynamic that says that there's something is wrong with some of you, not with all of us.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So when I look, I'm very conscious that when that the work has to start with self. So and now as a facilitator when going out, I have to make sure not that I take over conversation, but that I am part of that healing process, that I'm not showing that I'm a perfect, that I'm healed and transformed while the others aren't. Because there's that problem that comes where it says that you are better than me. And therefore nobody will really, you know, so there's all these dynamics that we got to look at in terms of understanding there's a collective communal responsibility. We have a state that is abusive. We have police that don't have accountability. We have ministers and others who have been accused of molesting women and children, and they have not been held accountable for it. So how are we going to go out there and tell somebody they mustn't do it? But we're not saying you have to be consistent. You can't expect the people out there on the road to be held accountable when you're not holding the big ones accountable, right? So we have to work. It is hard work, but it is work which is beyond the leaflets and brochures. You know what I mean? And even to an extent, the workshops help. But if there isn't a process of continuing, and that is not the responsibility of the government alone, certainly. I mean, the government has a role, but it's not the government alone who has to do that, right? You know, the government, the government's responsibility, it's not them alone. I mean, it's all of us to have to take a collective responsibility to learn about these things, to ensure that where the government comes in is to hold people accountable, where it's a justice system, etc., and to have the protective mechanisms. And then you can't be going into an education system to talk about issues such as consent when they're still beating children, because the beating is also a violation of the child's body, right? So you can't be doing that when you know what I mean? You can't be doing, and we had that experience where the teacher stamped with the wild cane. You're trying to do a workshop with children about child abuse and domestic violence, and the teacher stand up with a wild cane. They don't necessarily use it, but it is there, and you have to figure out, okay. Or another time I had the experience talking about hair, where a hair teacher came to a young black girl and pulled off her hair in front of all of us to fit in with the ministry's hair policy, where the minister still can't. No. You know, we gotta go. We have all the violence is interconnected. All these violences are interconnected. That's the other thing. I mean, you might want to think you're only dealing with child abuse on the one hand, but we're not dealing with the violence to the environment on the other hand. And God knows we're in pouring today all of a sudden, subconsciously reminded of that. So all violence is interconnected. You can't be dealing with one if you're not dealing with the other, right? And we are part of our environment. Our environment nurtures us. If we destroy the environment, this is the reaction we get. And part of the trauma is that as things fall apart, or we're dealing with flood and all of that, how are we going to be dealing with, we take on these stresses, right, as our survival. So there's a lot of work got to happen for the nonviolence work.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. There is a lot that needs to be done, and a lot of it does have to do with personal accountability and the ways within which we hold each other accountable also. Judah, I saw you had your hands up. Did you have any final thoughts you wanted to share before we close off?
Probably to share the numbers with Judah. Yeah.
Can hear you now. Yes.
Sure, about the numbers again.
Right, I'm gonna do that. As Mr. Kisu, I just wanted to elaborate a little bit on how, you know, a lot of times we say society this and society that, but who is society? It's us. And so every person has a responsibility, especially as far as, you know, those myths that we would have discussed earlier are concerned. A lot of times we say, well, look, boys can't make people abuse, and they can't do this because of what? But then when we get our sons and when we have our nephews, what are we teaching them? That they have to be X, Y, Z. And so indirectly, we are perpetuating that myth and the stigma. And so it starts with every one of us, and it has to start from even before birth. I know a lot of us have our values and our values that we feel quite strongly about. And a lot of us have very strong ideologies. But education or the re-education of the boy child has got to start. So that's what I wanted to say. Concerning our ministry, as it relates to our ministry, we have services available. Poverty is no excuse. We have, when it comes to women, we have our Women Empowerment Center that's in Covenant, where we offer several classes. And it's not just for women, but men can also attend these classes. They can come into us to know about it. We have our recruitment and manpower agency that helps individuals to find jobs. And so these are services we offer. We also offer counseling. There's so many services. So just don't sit down in your house and say, well, look, I don't have bread and I don't have butter. You've got to come out, and you have got to actually want that change. You have to want the change. And so I'm going to close there, and I'm going to just give the numbers out. And so the first number I want to give you is quite short. It's 914. Again, that's our 24-hour hotline. You can call. Even if it's not a child abuse matter, you can call and you're going to get advice. Secondly, we have our Child Care and Protection Agency hotline. That's 227-0979. That's 227-0979. There, put it in the chat. There's also our office number, which is 225-1257 and 227-4082. So feel free to call us and feel free to seek services. These services are free, and these services you're entitled to. So we are willing to work with you. We're willing to work with families, and we are willing to continue to collaborate with ChildLink and our other stakeholders to bring about awareness and to ensure that every child in Guyana is safe. It's quite a task, but we can do it.
Thanks so much, Judah, and thank you for sharing. Vidya, do you have any final thoughts before we close?
Yeah, just to remember that if anyone who's listened to this has been moved by anything that we've said, please feel to reach out to get counseling. Any boys or men who've heard this, who've had these experiences, it's okay to talk about them now. Get help. Don't feel ashamed. For many of us, many abusers, many survivors of child sexual abuse have gone on to, it impacts different people differently. However, it has affected you. Please feel free to talk. Or there should be no. We should not be shaming those who have survived, but we should be shaming the abusers and the predators. And also let's just keep talking in our communities about how we're dealing with violence towards children, and the violence towards each other, to our environment. That we really got to keep talking about this and changing, learning about what has caused this and wanting to change, and then doing and that. For those of you who might be listening as parents who hollering and beating at the children who don't hear, the first change is for you to realize that you don't have to beat the children for them to hear you. Right? It might sound so, but then, sorry, let's just stop. But that's the first change. If you can stop beating your children, that's about you. Before you do anything else, before you go talking about sexual abuse or anything, if you think it's okay to beat children, change that first, and then we'll work with the rest of it. I went through that process myself to work with Help and Shelter. I started out. I then learned that it was wrong to beat children, and the connection between beating children and domestic violence generally. There is a connection between the two in our society. We then learned about child sexual abuse, and I know from adult survivors that, especially guys who've talked to me, that there's a lot of work got to go on with talking, healing, and recovering from it. That some guys have been affected in their relationships later on in life, and sometimes very much later on in life. They go on, they might have, had their work, their families, their loving fathers, they attempt to do that, but then things come back, flashbacks come and all of that, and they don't understand. And it's now that people are learning about things like stress and body pain, stress and health, and how chronic diseases are connected to some of these things. So that's how we're learning about these things, and therefore we got to learn, to deal with it, because as you get older, all these dimensions. I know men's health is an issue that a lot of us don't want to talk about as men. We think that we don't have to talk about it. So it's important to talk about these issues, how they've affected, and also what we can do, not only that, in helping ourselves, but in helping others. It's not about shaming now, it's about recovering, healing, and we're preventing for the future. If anyone here is in contact with children, girl children and boy children, please ensure that you are doing the awareness work with those children. I think ChildLink had resources like the TEL scheme and all the other schemes. So do the work with the children, teach them about consent, teach them about their bodies, teach them their rights, don't beat them. You can't teach them about the rights of the wild cane in your hand, right? If you're doing that. And yeah, the children have rights too. I know in your house, some of you say that in your house, you children got no rights if you come out. But we have to understand what rights mean, and rights and responsibility. We gotta learn. Remember, we come from these colonized histories, and we have a bad image that human rights only applies to people on death penalty or something like that. But we don't recognize that we all have human rights, and we also have duties to those in our care to give them, to ensure that they enjoy their rights too.
Thanks so much, Vidya, and thanks so much, Judah, for being with us here today and for sharing. I know that anyone who has been watching has been learning quite a lot and probably has a lot to mull over too when it comes to their own personal accountability and the habits and attitudes that they can change to promote safer environments. So thanks once again for your time, and I look forward to speaking with you again soon. Take care. Bye.
Welcome. Take care.
Take care to everyone listening.